All right, let's get into it. Today, we're looking at a book that might just turn everything you thought you knew about early Christianity completely upside down. It's called The Religion of the Apostles by Father Stephen DeYoung, and wow, does it make a bold claim about what Jesus' first followers were really all about. When we think of the very first Christians, this is kind of the picture that pops into our heads, right? Something really simple. A small group of people, maybe gathered in a plain room, listening to one of the apostles break down a pretty straightforward message. Jesus is the Son of God, He died for your sins, so believe in Him, love each other, and you'll be saved. It's an image of a very pure, very simple faith.
But what if that whole picture, as common as it is just wrong? What if the actual religion of the apostles was something way more complex, way more ancient, and honestly, a lot weirder to our modern minds than we've ever been led to believe?
So here it is. This is the book's central and kinda shocking claim. It argues that the elaborate ritual-filled worship you might see in an Orthodox Christian church today, with the incense, the chanting, the whole deal, is actually closer to what the apostles themselves believed and practiced than that simple little house church we all imagine. It's a huge claim, so let's see how the author builds the case. To even begin to understand this, we first have to bust what the book calls the myth of simplicity. And that means we have to challenge a really basic assumption many of us have, not about early Christianity, but about the Jewish world that the apostles came from. You see, for a long time, people just assumed that the Judaism of the first century was this one, single, unified religion. But, as the book points out, modern scholars have totally changed that view. We now know it wasn't one Judaism at all. It was more like a whole collection of diverse Judaisms, with all kinds of different beliefs swirling around. The apostles lived and breathed in a very specific historical moment called the Second Temple period. This is so important to get. The author argues that this era had its own unique and incredibly complex worldview, a worldview that's been almost totally forgotten today, but for the apostles, it was just reality. It was the air they breathed. So what did this forgotten worldview actually look like? This is where things get really wild. We're about to step into a spiritual world that's way richer and way more complicated than what most of us probably learned in Sunday school. The book highlights a few key things. First, the apostles believed the spiritual world was a busy place, with God surrounded by a divine council of powerful angelic beings. Second, and this is a big one, the idea of God existing as more than one person? That wasn't some brand new idea the Christians cooked up. And third, they saw the Old Testament law not as something that was now useless, but as a deep story that was finally reaching its climax. So, what this all means is that the common argument, the one that says telling a first-century Jew that a man was God would have been completely offensive and blasphemous, well, that argument just doesn't hold water when you look at the evidence. Their religious world already had a place for a concept like that. Let's see how. Okay, let's dive into what is probably the most mind-bending part of this whole thing. The idea that a multi-personal view of God existed in Jewish thought before Jesus ever walked the earth. This really goes against the modern idea that the Old Testament teaches a strictly singular, one-person God. The book points to these mysterious figures in the Old Testament like the angel of the Lord or the word of the Lord. Now, these figures are described as being separate from God, and yet in the very same passages, they're also identified as Yahweh, the God of Israel. They speak as God, they act as God, and the apostles would have known these scriptures inside and out. Okay, there's a fancy theological word for this. It's hypostasis. It just means a distinct person within the single Godhead. And the book's argument is that this wasn't some new idea invented hundreds of years later at a church council. The framework for understanding God as multiple persons in one being, it was already there, in the world of the apostles.
So the takeaway here is kinda revolutionary. The apostles weren't starting from zero, trying to make up a totally new theology to explain Jesus. No, they were taking their incredible, world-shattering experience of the resurrected Christ and fitting it into the religious framework they already had. They saw Jesus as the fulfillment of everything they already believed.
And that brings us right to this next huge idea, fulfillment. This concept is absolutely central to how the apostles saw everything. For them, Jesus didn't come to replace or cancel the Old Testament, He came to complete it, to fill it up until it was overflowing with meaning. So let's put these two ideas side by side. On one hand, you have the idea of replacement, which basically says the Old Testament is obsolete now. But on the other hand, you have the apostles' view, fulfillment. In their eyes, Christ was the answer to all the questions the Old Testament had been asking for centuries. He was the solution to the problems laid out in the very beginning of the story. According to the book, Christ's mission was to fix three huge cosmic problems that go all the way back to the book of Genesis. First, you've got Adam's fall, which brought death into the world. Second, there was a rebellion of angelic beings that spread corruption everywhere. And third, the Tower of Babel, which didn't just scatter people, it led to the nations becoming enslaved to dark spiritual forces. Christ's work was seen as the ultimate answer to all three of these ancient disasters.
So, where is all this heading? Well, now we're going to pull all these different threads together to see the book's final and maybe most surprising conclusion. It's an argument about an unbroken chain of belief stretching back thousands of years.
This timeline basically flips the script on how we think about religious history. The story starts with the complex faith of the Second Temple period. Then the apostles see and interpret Jesus through that exact lens. But then, and this is key, centuries later, Rabbinic Judaism forms partly as a reaction against this Christian interpretation, and it simplifies its theology. So in this view, it's actually Rabbinic Judaism that's the new innovation, while Orthodox Christianity is the direct continuation of that original ancient complex faith.
The big idea here, then, is that core Christian beliefs that we often think were added on centuries later, like the Trinity or the full divinity of Christ, weren't additions at all. According to this book, they were inheritances, carried over directly from the rich and deeply spiritual world that the apostles themselves inhabited.
And really, this quote from the book's afterword just lays it all out on the table. The argument is for a total living continuity connecting the worship and beliefs of the Orthodox Church today straight back to the religious life of the apostles.
So we're left with this really mind-bending question to chew on. We always think of Christianity as a 2,000-year-old religion. But what if its core worldview, its understanding of God, humanity, and the entire cosmos was already ancient at the very moment it was born? What if the religion of the apostles wasn't a radical new beginning, but the long-awaited fulfillment of something much, much older?